Hey everyone, and welcome as we continue our study through the New Testament Gospels, looking at the 250 events in the life of Jesus. And today we're looking at Jesus' teaching about marriage and divorce. And this comes from Matthew 19, verses 3 through 12, and Mark 10, verses 2 through 12. I'm going to be going out of Matthew. They parallel each other for the most part here, but if you want to use Mark, that's you're more than welcome to. And so we start here in Mark 19, verse 3, and it says, some Pharisees came and tried to trap Jesus with this question. They were always constantly trying to trap Jesus, and they never successful. But, they would do this. And so this one they said, should a man be allowed to divorce his wife for just any reason? And so Jesus asked them, and this is one of the things I love about Jesus, is he rarely actually answers a question directly. He typically answers a question with another question. And so he says, haven't you read the scriptures? They record that from the beginning God made them male and female, and he said, this explains why a man leaves his father and mother and is joined to his wife, and the two are united into one. Since they are no longer two but one, let no one split apart what God has joined together. Then so the Pharisees respond, then why did Moses say in the law that a man could give his wife a written notice of divorce and send her away? And so Jesus said, this is why, right? Moses prohibited divorce only as a concession to your hard hearts, but it was not what God had originally intended. We should understand that. I hope we understand that. And I tell you this, whoever divorces his wife and marries someone else commits adultery, unless his wife has been unfaithful. And so then at this point, Jesus' disciples turn to him and say, if this is the case, it's better not to marry. They're like, man, this is hard. And because at that time, honestly, kind of like today, marriage was looked at. It's like, okay, I'm tired of you. I'm giving you a divorce and move on. And God, Jesus is saying here, that's not how this was intended. And in fact, if you do that, you're committing adultery when you do that. We dove deeper into what this means about adultery and different things, and in one of our Q&As, and maybe we'll do a deeper study on this. I'm not going to dive into it too much, but this idea there, but there is this idea out there that if you marry someone else, you commit adultery, but that you continuously committed, like it's an ongoing act, like you all continue. And that's actually, if you read the context of this, it's saying when you do that, you commit adultery, and that is the act of adultery is committed, but that doesn't mean it's an ongoing sinful act. It's meaning you've committed adultery because you've slept with someone else. And so we can dive deeper into that. If you have questions about that, you can put it in the chat. But we'll dive deeper into that a little bit. But if you look at the context of the way that's said, and the tense in which it's said, it's not an ongoing thing. It's something that happens or happened, and then you move on from it. And so again, the disciples are like, well, then it's better not to marry. And so Jesus said, not everyone can accept this statement. He's like, not everyone can accept it, especially in that day and age. Only those whom God helps. Some are born as eunuchs, and so he's kind of for that. So some it's easy not to worry about marrying. Some have been made eunuchs by others, and some choose not to marry for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Let anyone accept this who can. And so this was a hard statement for them, because especially they came from a culture where divorce was common. And it was not uncommon for a man to get tired of a woman and send her off with a certificate of divorce. And so very similar to today's society, where men and women, back then women didn't have the right to divorce a man, you know and so we see this very radical I move from that was like, hey, no, marriage was intended to be permanent. It was intended to be a lifelong thing till death do you part, and that's what we should strive for. And so, the Pharisees again here, they were trying to trick Jesus by having him choose sides in the two different theological controversy here, or in a theological controversy. There's two schools of thought, right? One supported divorce for almost any reason. They liked the idea, especially the men. They liked the idea of they got tired of their wives and they could send her away and find someone else to marry. And so, you look at how this was set up, and it was very horrible for women back then. And so Jesus is actually leveling the playing field here a little bit. And so the other, right, believe that divorce could be allowed only for marital unfaithfulness, and really that's where we set up today as a church, right? The idea should be that divorce should only happen in marital unfaithfulness. Now, I tend to go a little bit deeper into what unfaithfulness is. I don't believe it's just sexual immorality or adultery, right? Because I believe that if a man is beating the mess out of a woman, then she has every right to divorce him and marry someone else. And we dove deeper into that again. That's another thing. Maybe we'll just have to do a whole lesson on divorce and hash that out. But again, it's, and so they had this conflict here that hinged on the two different groups, that how they interpreted Deuteronomy chapter 24 verses 1 through 4. In his answer, so however, he focused on marriage rather than divorce. They're focusing on, well, how is it okay for me to get a divorce? And then Jesus like, no, don't focus on divorce, focus on marriage. And so he pointed out that God intended marriage to be permanent, and he gave four reasons for that, and that's in Matthew 19 verses 4 through 6 there that you see that. And so the law that they're talking about is like I said, it was Deuteronomy 24 1 through 4. And in Moses' day as well as Jesus' day here, right, the practice of marriage fell far short of God's intention, and it's that same way today. And so we see that today. I mean, in fact, most of our churches, right, the divorce rate in most of our churches matches that of the world, if in some cases it's not worse. And so Jesus said that Moses gave this law only because of the people's hard hearts. He permitted it. His permanent marriage was what God intended from the beginning. And if we read the Bible, we should understand that. But because the sinful human nature made divorce inevitable, Moses instituted some laws to help its victims. Because especially in that day, if you look at it, if men could just divorce women and leave them, women didn't have any rights, and it was a lot harder. So it wasn't like today where if a man and a woman got divorced, then the man had to pay child support or something like that. No, he just got rid of her. And so, right, so these were what we would fall under what we call civil laws, and they were designed especially to protect women in that culture who were quite vulnerable, especially while living alone. A woman living alone back then could not almost survive. It was very hard for a woman to survive, and so a lot of times she would end up having to go into prostitution or something like that if she did not have a husband. And so, because of the way Moses wrote these laws, a man can no longer just throw his wife out. He had to write a formal letter of a dismissal, and there were some things behind that. And so this was a step back then. It was probably a radical step toward civil rights and for making men think twice about divorce instead of just being able to get rid of them for any reason. Here's the thing: God designed marriage to be indissoluble. It was, the two become one. Once two people become one, you can't separate them. Or, once you pour, a lot of times you'll have the marriage ceremonies and they'll take the different color sands and they'll pour them together, right? And they'll mix them all together. And you can't separate the two. If you mix red and blue sand together, you can't go in and separate the two after you've done that. And so that was the idea behind marriage. But instead of looking for reasons to leave each other, and this is what Jesus said, instead of looking for reasons to leave each other, husbands and wives should concentrate on how to stay together. And again, now we understand there's some instances where it's not going to happen, and I understand that, and we understand that there's, the husband or wife leaves, the husband or wife cheats, the husband and wife is abusive, and not just physically abusive, right? And I've seen places that teach that, oh well, you can only get a divorce and for adultery, and if he's beating you, and then you should stay. And I'm just like, no, that's dangerous. Anyone who teaches anything like that is dangerous, and you shouldn't listen to that. And so, but in most other cases, almost all other cases, if you're married to someone, you should do everything in your power, and then with the help of God being the main focus of your marriage, to work that marriage out. And again, that's the thing: is marriage is hard. It's extremely hard. It's not easy. That you're going to run into all kinds of problems as you get married, and it's easy to get a divorce. It's easy to be 2 or 3 years and say, you know what, I don't want to do this anymore. It's hard work to try to push a marriage all the way through, especially when you're not getting along, especially when you got issues you got to work out, those kind of things. Marriage can be very hard. And so he then switches into, they ask this question, and the apostles or disciples are like, well, then it's better just not to get married if that's the case. And he's like, not everyone can accept this teaching. He's not, and some of them are right. It is, for some people, it probably is better not to get married, because if you're not going to be able to work it out, and especially if you're not going to be able to do it the way that they were doing it back then. And so he talks about a eunuch, right? A eunuch was an emasculated male. It's basically a male with no testicles, right? And back in that day, some people were born that. Sometimes it was a punishment that was done to people. But Jesus's point here is that some people have physical limitations that prevent their marrying, right? And back in that day, being a eunuch would have, women wanted to marry someone who could give them children, to give them up, so they could continue lines and all that stuff. That was seen as a great honor to be able to do those kind of things. And so eunuchs, and in that sense, and a lot of times wouldn't be considered marriage material. So that's why he's using that um, an example. Also, from the sexual side of this, Paul talks about this, where we'll talk about this in a minute. As a eunuch, right, sexual immorality is probably not as strong of an issue as what we would see with other people who are not in that situation. And so, he pulls that out. He says, while others choose not to be married, right, because in their particular situation they can serve God better as single people. And this is true. We see this, right? Jesus was not teaching here that we should avoid marriage because it's inconvenient or takes away our freedom. That would be selfish. He's not saying that. He's saying a good reason, if you want to remain single, is to use the time and freedom to serve God. Right. And Paul elaborates this in 1 Corinthians 7. And we know that, right? I mean, anyone who's married knows that it takes up time. There's things that you have to focus on, you have to pay attention to, especially if you have children, right? Whereas a single person can focus a lot of their time and attention on serving God, right? Whereas if you have a family, there's things you don't have as much free time. You don't have as much time to be able to serve to the kingdom. And so that's what he's pointing out here. He's not saying that you should, or that you stay single so you can serve the king. He's saying it's better to, if you're wanting to serve the king, because you have a lot more free time. And so, again, that's, you can read 1 Corinthians 7 and look what Paul teaches on that as well. And so, to sum this up, women were often treated as property in this day and age. They were treated as literally pieces of property. And so marriage and divorce was regarded as a transaction similar, in that case, to buying and selling land. In many cases, it was similar to buying and selling land. And so Jesus was condemning this attitude. He was condemning the attitude and clarified what God's original intention was, that marriage bring oneness. We see that in Genesis 2:24. And so Jesus held up God's ideal of marriage here and told his followers to live by that idea. And so that's what we see here when Jesus talks about marriage and divorce. He's saying, look, the way you guys are set up in divorce, and honestly, it would be very similar to us, and I think in our culture today, the way you view marriage is not proper, it's not right, and that's not how God intended it. And he intended it for two people to stay together through thick and thin, through life, except for in sinful some sinful situations, some sinful circumstances. And that is what he intended for God to do. And as a church, that's what we should push forward, and that's what we should push to. As always, I appreciate everyone for watching. If you haven't subscribed to our channel, please go ahead and do so. We're going to continue to push out studies, and then we'll do alternate studies like this one here. We'll probably do a study where we dive a little bit deeper into marriage and divorce and what the Bible says about that, taking all the Bible verses and pushing together. But if you haven't subscribed, do that. And as always, I appreciate everyone for watching.